Hi everyone, welcome to another video. Today I want to share with you two different ways to use the brand new 3D Poinsettia stamp set from Clair Stamps. For the first card, here's a look at the supply list. Now you can reference back to this later on if you want to, or you can grab your supplies and make this card along with me. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, here's a look at this stamp set. This is a larger set. It is 6 by 8 and it is filled with these little flowers that you can use together to make up one giant poinsettia. It's got some great little leaves. It's got some little holly berries and little ferns almost you can stick out from underneath it, and it's got a ton of great sentiments. So for the first card, I'm going to go ahead and use some plain white cardstock. Now I am going to watercolor on this, and that is because I have better luck with the intensity of my distress inks on my plain white cardstock. If you have better luck with watercolor paper, by all means go for that. This is just what works for me. So I'm using my Misty to stamp. I've also got my embossing bag here to go ahead and help rid me of any extra static cling that might be on my paper. And I'm going to be inking up all of my stamping with Versamark ink. Now this is a clear sticky ink that I use for heat embossing, which is exactly what I'm going to do today. So I've got the largest poinsettia flower already loaded up onto my Misty. I'm going to go ahead and ink that up very generously with my Versamark ink pad, and I'll go ahead and stamp this onto that piece of white cardstock. Now the great thing about using my Misty is I can go ahead and stamp this down once, and if I need to, I can re-stamp it as well. I can stamp it as many times as I need to get a good impression. So I flip my lid over, I'm pressing down firmly to go ahead and stamp that onto the paper, and then I'll lift that up, and now I'm going to go ahead and pull it out, and I'm going to sprinkle on some gold embossing powder. This is actually Princess Gold from Ranger. I'm sprinkling this over a coffee filter. I'm using this embossing powder so much that I want to leave it out. I don't want to clean it up each and every time. So the easiest way for me to do that is to go ahead and do it over a coffee filter. Then I can just clean it up and toss the coffee filter when I'm all done. If you keep your embossing powders in those little snap storage containers, you don't have to worry about that. But for those of us who don't, that is a great way to get around it. So next I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next size down flower. I've stamped that again the same exact way, Versamark ink. I did prep my paper first, and then I'll go ahead and sprinkle on that same gold embossing powder. Now I am heat setting each time. I'm not worrying about warping right now because I'll be fussy cutting these later, so it doesn't matter how much heat I apply to this paper. I actually kind of want that warped look a little bit almost. To give my flower more dimension later on, but I'm not worrying about warping now, so I'm heat setting each and every time. Now I also found that because these are so detailed and so large of stamps, I don't want to stamp any more than one at a time on those large ones. Now right now I'm stamping the two smallest ones together because I can kind of keep them very close together and put a lot of pressure on both of them. I don't miss any of the spots in stamping, but on the larger ones I just stamped one at a time. Now once I stamp those down, I'm going to do the same exact thing here, sprinkle on that Princess Gold embossing powder, and then I'll go ahead and heat set those as well. Now if you have any extra stray powders that your embossing bag didn't take care of, you can always grab a small paintbrush out and use that to dust them away. Now, while I had everything out, I'm also going to go ahead and stamp a few of the leaves here. I'm stamping 2 of the set of 2. And if you wanted to, you could stamp both of them and then only use one of them. This really is a very forgiving stamp set. So I'll go ahead and do that the exact same way I've done the flowers. I'm inking it up with Versamark ink, stamping it down onto my paper, and then I'll go ahead and cover in that same gold embossing powder that I used before on the flowers, and then I'll heat set that as well. Again, with these, I'm not going to worry about the warping at all. If it does, it's actually beneficial on my part. So for these, I'm going to do some watercoloring. Now again, I said I stamped on regular cardstock because I like the intensity that it gives me whenever I use my distress inks. I don't have to go in with layer after layer after layer. If you are somebody that really likes to do that, really likes to put in a lot of detail, this is not the kind of paper to use for you. Use your watercolor paper. But for me, this is what works. So I'm using 2 different colors of Distress ink. I used some Festive Berries and Worn Lipstick. And I am not staying inside the lines, you can see. I'm going to cut these out anyway, so I really didn't need to be very fussy with this. I dropped in some water, dropped in the color, and I'm letting it blend on its own. Now for the leaves, again, I used 2 different colors of green. I used Mowed Lawn, and I used Crushed Olive. Again, not staying inside the lines. Now for my second card, I actually needed these masks that you see in the top here. So I pulled those out and I'm using them as space holders. If you don't have masks on hand, just use the stamps as placeholders or kind of guesstimate. So I'm working on a scalloped white cardstock rectangle that I've die cut here. And I am just laying out those little branches and berries that go kind of around the poinsettia. I position them from my mask, and I'm also got that sentiment on there as well. I am using the Season's Greetings stamp or sentiment from that stamp set on this card. I'll use a different one later on. You could interchange these and use any one you wanted. They're all gorgeous. They've all got that scripty, gorgeous font. They just fit perfectly with this stamp set. And whether you go for a more feminine or kind of pretty look, or you go for a more grungy, almost distressed look with this stamp set, they work either way. They're really versatile. Now I went ahead and inked those up with Versamark ink, and because I'm doing so many stamps, I did do a double stamping on this. That's just to help me have peace of mind to know that I got all of my ink on the paper. Now I did, like I said before, with my heat embossing, I prepped my surface, and I'm going to use that same Princess Gold embossing powder, sprinkling it over all of my little stamped images. Now I did 3 of the little twigs and also the berries, or 4, excuse me, and then I went ahead and stamped that sentiment in the top right hand corner. And then once I have that on there, I'll go ahead and heat set this. Now with this, I'm going to be a little bit more careful because I do want this to lay nice and flat on my card base. So in order to get that to where I don't get any warping with my heat gun, I let my heat gun get very nice and hot before I even bring it to the paper. And you can always hit it from behind, and that'll straighten it out a little bit if you get some warping. Now I let my watercolor dry, and then I came back in and I fussy cut each one of those images. Now if you don't want to fussy cut, Joy Clair Stamps does offer free SVG cutting files for all of their stamp sets. So if you have an electronic cutting machine, you don't have to worry about fussy cutting, but they will have that white border, so just remember that. Now in order to put this together, I'm going to use a couple different kinds of adhesive. I've got my Fun Foam and double-sided adhesive. It's just what I use for foam tape. Foam tape and I don't get along that well, so I use Fun Foam and double-sided adhesive. And I'm also using a wet glue, which is Glossy Accents. Now the first thing I did was I went ahead and put the leaves together. I've got 4 leaves that I put together, a set or 2 sets of 2. Now the little circle in each one of these images is designed to hold the glue so the next little piece can connect to it. So then for the flower, I just started layering up. I started with the largest flower on the bottom, making my way towards the smallest, laying them one on top of the other. Then I put the 3 little berries right in the center of that I also heat embossed in that gold embossing powder. I popped those up with a little bit of Fun Foam, and I'm also going to pop this flower up onto the leaves with more Fun Foam for added dimension. And you can see I bent those little petals up on the flower a little bit. That's where that warping kind of helps me out. It gives me that added dimension, but you can see this is a gorgeous 3-dimensional flower. Now what I'm going to do is actually put it directly onto the card base. I'm going to use that little circle that is right there in the center, put my liquid glue on there. You could use dry glue if you wanted to. I just know that Glossy Accents is going to hold everything in place. That's why I like to use it. It gives me a little bit of peace of mind. Once I had that positioned on there to cover each one of those little twigs that I stamped, I put an acrylic block right on top of that to hold it securely in place, mounted that panel onto a red cardstock panel, and then I put everything onto an A2 top folding card base to completely finish off this card. And I absolutely love the way this one turned out. I think this is going to be my Christmas card for this year. So moving on to my next card, here's the supply list for that card. Again, you can pause, go grab your supplies, make this card along with me, or you can come back here for reference later on. So the first thing I want to share with you is how I made my masks. So I like to use Memento Dew masking paper. That is a mouthful, but I just stamp onto that masking paper, fussy cut out each one of the little images, and then I've got my mask ready to go. Now you want to stamp on the white side of that paper, and then that blue backing paper will come off, and it's got a slightly tacky surface on the back. Now I've also die cut a piece of craft cardstock with that same scalloped rectangle I used beforehand. I used my masks as placeholders to kind of line up where I wanted my first stamp. And now I'm going to do a very flat poinsettia flower, so a lot of masking, but it's going to be a nice flat card. I'm also doing some no line coloring here, so I am stamping in red dye ink, and I'll go ahead and stamp down that first layer. Now this is going to be the opposite of the last one. I need to work from the front to the back of the flower. So that's the way masking works. So the first thing I needed to do was stamp my very top layer, which is the smallest layer. So I stamped that down exactly where I needed it to go. Then I'll go ahead and peel off that blue backing paper, and I'm going to place this mask right over that stamped image just to mask that off, and that's going to cover up any inking that might go on top of that and keep that image nice and clean. Now the smaller masks are a little fussy to get on, but once you get them on, just give them a little press with your finger and they'll stay in place until you peel them off. So once I had that smallest mask on, it was time to move on to my next size layer of petals here. So I grabbed the next size up. I'm going to go ahead and position this to where the leaves of this, or the petals of this flower, fall in between the last sets of leaves or petals. Then I'll go ahead and again ink this up with that red dye ink and stamp this down right over the top of that. Now again, I'm using my Misty here. You can use acrylic blocks for this. You don't need a stamp positioner. I just like to use it in case I need to do double stamping, because really I'm not that great of a stamper. I mess up a lot. So this just saves me from throwing things out. Now I went ahead and again put that mask right on top of my stamped image. I'll go ahead and clean that stamp off, put it away, and move on to the next size up, petals of leaves. I'll go ahead and place that right over the top, and because these are clear stamps, you can see right through them and get the placement perfect. I'll go ahead and ink this up, and I'm doing a double stamping here because as you move up in mass and the more masks you add, the firmer you need to press. Your ink has to make it through several layers of paper at this point, so you need to give it a very firm press, and you might need to stamp it a few times. I went ahead and placed on that next mask, and then I'll move on to my largest flower, ink that up, and stamp it down. Now again, I've got 3 layers at this point. I need to go ahead and stamp it a few times. Then I'll go ahead and clean that off, put it back on the backing paper, and now I'm going to move on to leaves. So I went ahead and masked off that largest flower. I'm going to grab my leaves, and I'll go ahead and stamp these next. Now again, I'm going to be doing some no-line coloring with my colored pencils, so I'm going to stamp these in some green dye ink. Now I want to position this to where it looks like the flower is hanging off the edge. So I just made sure to have those leaves hanging off on the left-hand side and a little bit on the bottom as well. Then I'll go ahead and ink that up with the green dye ink and stamp that down, and now it gives it a little bit more interest whenever you kind of cut things off at the side instead of just stamping them in the center all the time. I'll go ahead and do another set of leaves right here at the top, or slightly at the top right hand side. Once I have that positioned exactly where I want it, I'll pick it up with the lid of my Misty, go ahead and ink that up with that same green dye ink and stamp it down once more, again giving it a nice firm press here because I've got to make it through 4 layers of masking paper. Now I wanted to go ahead and add one more little stamp here. I didn't want the full set of 2 leaves, so I'm going to go ahead and pick up this stamp once I get the 1 leaf positioned exactly where I want it. Then, before I ink it up, I'm actually going to put a post-it note, a mini post-it note, right over the image that I don't want any ink on, that I don't want to stamp down. Then I'll go ahead and ink up my stamp that I want to stamp, remove that post-it note, and stamp down my image. The one on the right hand side is completely free of any ink, so it didn't stamp anything. I've got my 1 little leaf there and a great flat poinsettia ready to be colored up. Now, I went ahead and showed you in this video, I've got a separate video on this, of how you can save your masks for future use. I like to just put them on the backing sheet of my stamp set. They slide easily right back into the pocket. You don't lose them, and you always see them if you need to use them later on. Now, very quickly, I wanted to go ahead and add some of those little twigs and berries around this flower, so I grabbed out the masks again once I had colored this up with my colored pencils. I did that off camera. It was no line coloring. It took a while. And yeah, it was just extremely long to add to this already long video. So I'm moving around those masks while I go ahead and stamp some more of these little twigs outside of the flower. I'm stamping them down in Versamark ink, all of them first. Then I'll go ahead and put them over that same coffee filter that I used before and sprinkle on some white embossing powder for this card. I switched it up a little bit. I felt this was more of a rustic, almost country look, so I went with a very bright white. Now here you can see I got a little bit of embossing powder where I didn't want it on my image. My mask didn't quite go up to those leaves, and also just sometimes your fingerprints can also get a little oil on your paper that wants that embossing powder to cling to it. Just use a dry paintbrush and brush away any that is clinging to where you don't want it, because once you heat set it, it's not going anywhere. Now I heat set that off camera very quickly, and then I'll go ahead and stamp on my sentiment. Now again, I'm prepping my paper with my embossing bag, and then I'll go ahead and ink up my sentiment with some Versamark ink. I'll go ahead and stamp this down onto my paper, and for this card I actually used the Peace on Earth sentiment. This is gorgeous. I went ahead and sprinkled on some white embossing powder to match the little embossing that I did beforehand, and then I'll just go ahead and heat set that as well. I mounted that entire panel onto a green mat this time and put everything onto a side folding or top folding A2 white card base, excuse me. And on the center of this flower, I actually grabbed out some enamel accents in Glacier White, and I put a few drops of that right in the center for a little bit more dimension on this very flat card. There is a closer look at the second card where I use the same stamp set for a completely different look. Here's a look at both final cards together. You can see they're very similar in design, but they also look very different because of the different techniques I used with the same exact stamp set. On your screen, you're going to see a few different links you can click on. That does it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and a closer look at the 3D Poinsettia stamp set. Thanks for watching.